So as you've seen on the workshop's agenda, in this session, we're going to focus on funding, partnerships, and workforce. And to do that, we have 4 great panelists. We're going to start with Dr. Kan Chen, an associate professor in the Andrew Young School of Policy Studies at Georgia State University, where he founded and leads the Infrastructure Finance and Policy Lab. Dr. Chen also serves on the Transportation Research Board as part of the Committee on Economics and Finance. Dr. Chen.
Oh, all right. Okay, great. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me here. I really enjoyed the workshop. Even on my background is finance. I know my colleague Deborah is here. Thanks so much for inviting me. Today I will talk about finance, right? First message I always want to say, right? We know funding actually so important. Even we talk about transportation, sustainabilities. Okay, sustainabilities, and we want to be more sustainable, equitable, but I think the big thing is about the funding, right? Well, I know reliable, sufficient funding sources actually is the key to support the equitable transition for sustainable transportations. If we don't have money, right? If we don't have money, we don't have funding sources, how can we be able to build sustainable, equitable transporting infrastructure? So my argument is always financial or fiscal dimensions is very critical when we talk about transportation sustainability. I think you all know people talk about 3 pillars of transportation sustainabilities, talk about economic, social, and environmental, but I, as public finance scholars, I always think about fiscal dimension is super important, right? To support the 3 traditional dimensions of transportation sustainability. So that's why you can see I put fiscal here, right? I want you take one takeaway. I always emphasize finance money is super important when we talk about transportation infrastructure. Okay, so since it's a workshop, my presentation is not very research focused. I just want to talk about some basic things about funding finance. And many people don't know the difference between the funding and finance. When we talk about the funding for transportations, the funding sources actually mean a revenue stream, help way to pay for the cost of building transporting projects, right? The funding sources could be the tax, could be grants, whatever, right? And it could be multiple funding sources, right? And the finance actually is the way how we're going to pay for infrastructure. You maybe have one way, we have cash, I have all the money. I don't need to borrow money, right? So we call it pay-as-you-go. We call it pay-go finance. And another way called pay-as-you-use. Pay-as-you-use basically called borrow money. We'll have to borrow money to build the transport infrastructure, like the mortgage financing, right? So typically when people borrow, in the US, when you borrow money, right, we use the bonds, right? You have general obligation bonds, you also have revenue bonds. So this is traditional difference transporting funding and finance. And one of the questions asked about what are the traditional transportation funding sources. So there are different ways, right? You can buy sources. Transporting funding sources can be from the federal, for example, federal gas tax, right? It's the major revenue source for federal grants. Also states, we have a state gas tax, but also have a state sales tax, right? Income tax sometimes, right? And could generate from funding the transportations. I also have a local, right, funding sources, right? Like local option gas tax, also have a local sales tax, right? In Georgia, actually have a lot of local option sales tax for transportation infrastructure. And also think about the funding sources, right? Can also be from the user, right? People who use transport infrastructures pay for the cost. For example, gas tax, right? The more you drive, traditionally the more you drive, right? You have some damage for roads, you should pay for the cost of maintaining roads, right? But also have a lot of transporting sources from non-transportation related. For example, local option sales tax, right? Even sometimes have local option income tax pay for transporting infrastructures. Of course, here are the major traditional transporting funding sources. Something I already mentioned about that. We have a gas tax, right? Probably you know we have a federal gas tax. We also have a state gas tax. But very interesting, many people don't know. Some states also have a local option gas tax. For example, in Florida. The Florida county actually have a 12 cents local option gas tax earmarked for transporting infrastructures, right? It's not all the 50 states have a local option gas tax, but it actually have a lot, right, in Florida. Also state sales tax, right? We also have a motor vehicle tax fees, also have a tolling, pricing, fares, right? Also have a general revenue sources, also have intergovernmental grants. So this is a traditionally transportation funding sources. Okay, so here's questions. People always ask me, how much do we spend on transportation, right? If you look at this is revenue side, right? You can see the different lines, right? I think the up line is the combined federal states, right? And the purple line is still local, and the yellow line is the federal, right? So you can see the most recent data by 2021, the total spending is about $382 billion, right? Of course, still local governments is the major revenue sources, but the federal government also provide almost about $100 billion, right? This is on the revenue side. But if you look at the expenditure side, right, actually we spend more on the revenue, right? The spending actually is almost $400 billion. But you can see still local government is the major spending on the transportations. Federal government actually provide over $100 billion, but the direct expenditure on transportation actually not quite a lot, because the major federal spending on transportation go to state local highway grants. Okay, if you look at different model, right, by mode of transportation, obviously we spend a lot on highway, right? Relatively we spend less on transit, right? And one argument, there's no data. I will always argue we need to spend more money on active transportation mode, right? But the data actually not shown here. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about some challenges about funding equitable, sustainable transportations. So this is my personal observations. I studied transportation finance for over 10 years. So I have some observations when think about transportation finance. First, the big challenge for transportation finance in the US is the declining federal state gas tax revenue, right? You guys probably already know, right? Many people talk about electrifications. This is great for environmental, but it's really bad for finance perspective. Because traditionally we rely on the more you consume gasoline, the more revenue pay the roads, right? If you are reducing gasoline consumption, that's really bad. This is why at a policy perspective, environment policy, finance policy conflicted with each other, right? So definitely, if you want to encourage more, right, encourage more people to shift to using EVs, but we definitely have a big challenges about declining federal state gas tax revenue, because traditionally this is the major revenue sources for funding transportation, right? Here I have some figure here. You can see, right, by 2030, we lost around $50 billion for gas tax revenue. When we go to 2050s, the number almost triple, right? Almost $67 billion, right? So that's what as scholars, I think declining the gas tax revenue is a very important challenge in the US for finance transportations. And policymakers, right, need to discuss, right? We need to think about that, right? If we want to shift to more sustainable, clean transportations, we need to think about the financing. I think this is a key message. If we don't have money, how we can build the transport infrastructures, right? Okay, so second, because of declining federal state gas tax revenues, there's a shift, right? Local governments using local option transportation tax. Typically, they're using local option sales tax, right? For example, in Georgia, actually a lot of Georgia counties, right, using a local option sales tax. But typically, this is not what we call a user fee generated, because this is a very broad tax, right? The more we rely on shift to local option sales tax, actually more or less equitable, right? Because think about the equity, people who use the transportation should pay the cost, right? And also less efficient, right? Okay, so this is a message. Okay, if you shift to use a lot of local option transportation sales tax, maybe make more funding more less equitable and also less efficient. Of course, we have a big problem right now, right? Many people talk about inflations, right? So I have a rising transportation, construction cost, labor cost. And also one message I already mentioned, if you think of transportation, it's not only about the roads, about the highway. We need to think about active transportation, right? Bicycle infrastructure, walking infrastructures, plus public transportation. Okay, another transportation, think about federal governments. There's become, we know there are lots going federal grants support transportations, but also you have increasing competitions for federal funds. Also, if you want to use federal funds, you have to comply with federal laws, federal regulations, right? And also federal funding is subject to the lawmakers, the approval, right? Sometimes have long-term concerns about the funding, stability, certainties, and also some, especially for some rural communities, small communities, they don't have strong capacities in staff in matching funding capacities. So this is some actually problems when you think about apply federal granting funding. Of course, there are some approaches to address challenges. Right now, we try to funding transportations. Obviously, short-term quick solution just to increase the gas tax, right? And I think many states already do that, right? And there's also an argument want to increase federal gas tax, right? But of course, politics matter, right? But basically, the short-term solutions, if you want to increase transporting funding source, just increase gas tax, right? Index them with inflations. But this is just short-term solutions, right? What I call a long-term solution, definitely I would big support. We need to replace gas tax with VMT fees. This can solve the problems. Now we want to transition to electrifications, right? So regardless you're EV driver, you are traditional cars, right? 1 mile drive, right? I'm going to charge you 10 cents, right? And I think this is more equitable, more efficient, right? Of course, sometimes we think about low income, we can give some people credit, right? Okay, and also we need to increase huge support. We need to increase funding for active transportations, for transit, for biking, for walking infrastructures. Transportation not only about the highways, right? And I think that's also big. And also, besides traditional way to finance transportations, we need to be creative, smart financing transportations. So recently I have a book. I talk about innovative financing. So when you think about innovative financing for infrastructures, there's no 3 ways. First, new funding sources, right? For example, now 50 states, I think already 32 states already have a using electric vehicle tax. Basically, every year when you want to renew your car, you have to pay additionally, right? And electric vehicle renew your car registration, you pay additionally. For example, in Georgia, in addition to pay traditional car registration renew fee, you have to pay $200, right? To compensate the lost revenue if you're driving electric vehicle, right? Also a big support is VMT fee, right? And something actually not done in the US, but in European countries like carbon tax, right? Some countries are already using carbon tax, right? To funding transportation, climate resilient infrastructures. Also local option taxes, right? This is kind of new options. As I mentioned before, many people think about local option get tax, always think about local option sale tax, but there's also potentially think about local option gas tax, right? Because gas tax usually more equitable, more efficient than sales tax. Of course, sales tax, you have a broad tax base. New financing mechanisms, which means traditionally, as I mentioned before, when you wanted to fund money, borrow money for building transport infrastructures, you're just using debt financing, using general obligation bonds, revenue bonds, but now we can using some new way borrow money. You can borrow money from TIFIA loan, right? You can borrow money from still local infrastructure bank loans. And you maybe think about the new bonds, like green bonds, specifically for building some climate resilient transporting infrastructure projects. There's also new financial arrangements. Traditionally, government play a very important role in planning, design, operation, maintenance infrastructures, but sometimes maybe do public-private partnership. We can engage private sectors in building transportation infrastructure, right? I know the workshop, I talked to some folks here in lunchtime. We have some business school right here. So I think definitely we need to engage business sectors, right? Because they have a huge interest in transportation sectors. So I think a lot of collaboration, funding collaboration, right, between public sectors, private sectors in building transport infrastructures. Also have a non-profit sectors. Sometimes also have huge interest in building equitable, sustainable transportation infrastructure. Okay, of course, when you talk about equities, definitely right now, you probably know, right, that right now federal government have a big emphasis on equity in transporting findings. So some way we can institutionalize equity in federal, states, local, their transportation funding policy, program plans. Also very important because historically, disadvantaged communities, they don't have strong capacities, right? You don't have staff capacities, right? You have a poor credit ratings, even don't have credit rating histories. So probably we need to make access to these competitive grants more inclusive, more equitable, more targeted to historically disadvantaged communities. And also have incorporate equity metrics when we think about funding education. And also, I think very important, right? We needed to use some performance management, right? We have performance measures in terms of equity in transportation, right? And we can link transporting funding with performance measurement in equitable, sustainable transportations. Of course, sometimes we need to provide some information disseminations, technical assistance, especially for some rural communities, some disadvantaged communities. Okay, so last I want to mention is because there's a lot of money right now in federal government, right? So the big thing for state local, if you want to build equitable sustainable transportation, is definitely you can leverage huge federal money available. Even US DOT, right? They have a called Justice 40 Initiative, which means at least 40% the benefits from federal transport investment should target to disadvantaged communities. So I think there's two programs here, but I provide the link. Right? If you click the link, you can see there's many federal program options here. So definitely, if you want money to build, right, sustainable, equitable transport infrastructure in your local communities, definitely check out the list of funding available. All right. Okay. So last question is, if we have a funding, why? How we make sure the project selected can really achieve equities in transportation funding, right? That's I think always we need to make the voice for historically disadvantaged communities, their voice matters, right? Definitely we need to engage public in historically disadvantaged communities. And we can incorporate equity objectives, community engagement in the planning process. So before you think about the financing, you need to carefully select, prioritize the projects, right? So capital planning also very important, right? When you prioritize the projects, have huge potential to increase equities in the top project list. Of course, we need to bring historically disadvantaged communities, their visions and needs into the project selections and designing process. So last image, this is my book. If you're interested, you can see I talk about different ways, examples, talk about how we can be smart, creative in financing infrastructures. So I'm looking forward to your comments, suggestions. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Celeste Chavis, professor and interim chair of the Department of Transportation and Urban Infrastructure Studies at Morgan State University. She's a licensed professional engineer whose research focuses on operations, safety, and performance metrics for transportation systems through an equity lens. She also recently co-chaired the Baltimore Mayor's Transportation and Infrastructure Transition Committee. Dr. Chavis.
All right, thanks for inviting me here today. I thought a lot about what to talk about with this audience being mixed between academics and professionals, so I decided to talk about some work that I've done that is not in the ivory tower so much, but it's really kind of bridging research, advocacy, policy work together, and that's dealing with some complete streets legislation that I helped work on in Baltimore, and stuff that I'm proud of, but it has not been easy. I'll talk a little bit about some of the community pushback that's been associated with the legislation and why that is, and some of the lessons learned that we've gained, and then relate it to other things that were part of our tasks, like workforce diversity and things like that. So Baltimore, Maryland, just a little context. It's a majority black city. We're about 60% black in Baltimore. You can see the stat on the right, about 1 in every 3 households does not have access to a car. We predominantly rely on bus in Baltimore. We do have 2 rail lines that go very limited in where they go, but pretty much the majority of all trips are taken by bus when they're not in a personal automobile. However, if you look at our more historically disadvantaged communities, that goes up to about every 2 out of every 3 households do not have access to a car. And so one of our councilmen has really been a big proponent on sustainable transportation, and he developed and eventually passed in 2018 the Complete Streets Ordinance, which I hope to review. And so this ordinance basically set the framework for developing a manual that was the guidelines that the Department of Transportation uses when redesigning our street space. And so, of course, the goal of this legislation was to address historic inequities, I should say inequities, in street design, and ensure that our roadways are being designed to accommodate all users using a data-informed manner. And so once that legislation got adopted, a group of consultants, a couple academics, some community groups, worked on the actual manual, which is the guiding document that the city has to abide by. And so that outlined design standards. It did develop the modal hierarchy that the city uses now in transportation projects, looks at different street typologies, set recommended speed limits and things based on the street typology. There was also a project prioritization process and a very brief thing mentioned on community engagement in the manual. And so now about 3 years in, I think the public is more aware of complete streets and are seeing some of the projects that have come about. And there has been some backlash to it. This year, in 2023, we had 2 city council hearings on the effectiveness of this legislation. I went to the first one. It was 3.5 hours long, just to set the context of how polarizing this issue has been. And we had heard from Baltimore City DOT members. We've heard from advocacy groups on both sides of the issue as part of this. But despite when all this is happening, about a week, I think, after we had the first hearing, Baltimore City was awarded a $1 million Safe Streets for All grant, the largest grant awarded in this program, largely because of this Complete Streets program and the efforts that are taking place. So it's very interesting when you see kind of that dichotomy being worked out. And so here's the modal hierarchy. So walking is at the top, followed by more cleaner modes of transportation like cycling, transit, and micromobility. Then you have your commercial, taxis, and shared modes in the third level, followed by single occupancy trips on the lower level. Here are some examples of some of the kind of street elements that have been designed. We now have some bus-only lanes on certain parts of the city. And actually, those lanes we allow cyclists just due to the limited street infrastructure. And then you can see some of the cycling and pedestrian related infrastructure that's been implemented as well. So cycling is a small piece of the Complete Streets legislation, but is the largest piece of the conversation around why people are unhappy with the legislation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as I go. So of course, from an equity standpoint, on paper, this thing seems to address a lot of the different forms of equity and things that we care about, right? We have this modal hierarchy system that is trying to uplift the most vulnerable roadway users. It's climate forward, so we're thinking about the impact to future generations. It has been legislated, so we are addressing structural equity, so we're not. Since that bill's passed, we've had 3 DOT directors, so you can see how important something like that is. But the key piece is this procedural equity piece, and I think that is where the community is probably the most dissatisfied and why we're seeing some of the feedback that we've gotten. And so I'll just play this short clip so you can kind of hear. Do we have sound?
A resolution by Councilmember Sharon Green Middleton was behind a hearing Thursday.
Nope.
Bike infrastructure.
Okay.
Part of Complete Streets, a local law that over time will change the landscape of the city. The intent of the plan is to make streets safer and more accessible to pedestrians, bicyclists, and public transit users.
The main problem is lack of community engagement directed to each individual designed area.
But over the years, as projects across the city continue or soon approach, some residents are raising concerns about the impacts of the roadway changes, including meeting the individual needs of each diverse neighborhood. While the City Department of Transportation says their approach is not one size fits all, there's now a call for a moratorium on new bike lanes, the removal of some existing ones, and a pause on the city's ordinance.
First, lack of inclusion. To be at the table with decision-making power.
They hate the delays that occur because these streets are being carved up. Baltimore deserves better.
Others, such as Paul Emmart, came to testify in support of the ordinance. Weather permitting, Emmart says he bikes a 10-mile round trip to get to and from work weekly and wants the protection of bike lanes.
But I think that it's one of the most important aspects of equity this city has.
Anyone can cycle, regardless of their age, their race, their economic status.
Bike More, a nonprofit organization working with DOT to monitor and advise on infrastructure plans and improvements, wrote a statement to WJC that reads in part, quote, "We support Baltimore City's nationally recognized equity-driven Complete Streets Ordinance, which empowers the city to access millions of dollars in federal funds to implement life-saving traffic calming, ADA transit, and bicycle infrastructure. We are pleased to see supportive written testimony submitted from more than 1,000 city residents. We are concerned when activism from a small group of individuals is continuously platformed."
Okay, so I don't know if everyone heard, but some of the major issues was really around engagement with the community and feeling like they weren't involved in the process. I don't know if people were here at the earlier session. Obayi mentioned a lot about empowering the community and when you engage in the community. So I think one of the biggest kind of complaints is that they did not feel that they were being engaged early enough in the process, right? So a lot of the engagement was, hi, we're changing this roadway, these are the alternatives, not opposed to, is there a need to change? What are you looking for? What are your priorities? And so trying to shift maybe earlier on in that process of when we're engaging with the community is important. And there's also different priorities. So street space is limited, so there's been a lot of discussion about, of course, removing parking and things like that, because in Baltimore, we don't have the best of transit systems, and we really are still a pretty car-dependent city. And so just a couple of lessons learned from this is just the importance of authentic, equitable engagement that's two-way and not really extractive in nature. Also having a diverse workforce. So you heard briefly about an advocacy organization called Bike More, which I've worked closely with. They do great work in the city of really promoting safe, clean transportation, centered on bike, but also a lot of pedestrian and transit work too, since we know that they're all related. But they are kind of seen as the polarizing organization in this group. And then also just to recognize that the people we heard from are coming from their own lived experiences and history, and it comes from a very real place. And so some of their concerns are not just unfounded concerns, right? They come from a history of seeing what transportation has done to their neighborhoods. And so I just proposed some questions kind of to get us to think about, when thinking about engagement, why should the community give their time? Like, why should I come out to this meeting after work, after I've been working all day, when I need to feed my kids? Why am I even asking the community to come out? Is it authentic? Is it going to change what's happening? Have I even taken the time to establish trust within the community that I'm working in? If that trust is not there, you'll see very different interactions with who you're working with, and that takes time to establish trust. Thinking about who is at the table, but also who's not at the table and who's being underrepresented in either my outreach or my study for the researchers who are in the room. Considering who you're partnering with. So as I said before, Bike More does amazing work, and so they're really seen front and centered. But I think perhaps the city may also need to think about some other organizations that they can partner with too on projects to make sure that they're getting some diverse voices as they're going through these projects. And then, of course, why we're doing the work. So this graphic just comes from USDOT, which has a new document out about equitable, community engaged work. And one of the things I think is most important is this number 6, which is the share back, is one that we often leave out, is we ask the community to take their time, but they don't know what the result of their time is and how their input is being used. So just uplifting that a bit. And so having a diverse workforce is important. So that organization I spoke of, Bike More, is actually very diverse in its staffing. Membership is probably less diverse. It's seen as a very more white and affluent organization that's not really reflective of Baltimore City, and I think that has posed a problem. So Morgan State, where I teach at, is a historically black college and university in Baltimore, and so a diverse workforce is central to my mission as an administrator there. And so to all my employers in the room, just, think about who you are recruiting from. Are they all coming from the same schools? In the sense of Baltimore, just what is their local knowledge? We find that a lot of our practitioners are like myself, who are transplants to the city. And so there's a lot of very nuanced local knowledge that's needed in Baltimore. Every neighborhood has a very different vibe and theme, and it's important to have that local knowledge. And then thinking about what you're doing personally to increase the pipeline. Are you working with high schools, local institutions? Do you provide growth opportunities within your company? One thing MDOT does, which is the Maryland Department of Transportation, that's really great, is they have a employee tuition reimbursement program. And so Morgan has really recruited a lot from people who are in the transportation industry already, who are seeking upward mobility. Here's one of my examples of alumni in our program. He was a bus operator for 11 years and then got his undergraduate degree in our program. And you can imagine what that type of expertise does when you are a transportation planner or engineer, of having grown up in the city, operated the bus for 11 years, so you really know what it's like from both sides, thinking about working with the union and so forth. And so in a very short time, he ended up leading the transit division in the city and is now working for a consulting firm, so maybe thinking about kind of training from within. And then when we say diversity, people often think of race, but that's not all that it is. So this is that organization I spoke of. You can see their staff at the top, 75% folks of color. They're doing great. But the face of the organization is the executive director, so you can see how that could maybe pose some issues. But it's also not just about race, too. I mean, there's issues of culture, thinking about people who moved to Baltimore versus grew up in Baltimore, age, class, education, all sorts of things. So when we say diversity, it's really quite broad. And even thinking about working at a historically black college where we're predominantly black. My experience as someone who grew up in the Midwest is different than someone who grew up in Baltimore City. It's different than that first generation student who might have been raised by, immigrant parents. We all check the same box of black, but we have all very different experiences. And then my last slide is just to recognize and respect the history and lived experience. What you see in the background is the Highway to Nowhere in Baltimore. It's a segment of highway that was built before the freeway revolts killed the remaining of the project, and it bisected, it bisected a black community. And so you got to remember that these are some of the histories that people are living with, and they know the impact that transportation has had on them and their families. And in particular with sustainability, I think we have to be very careful in how we frame it. In a city like Baltimore, when you tell people try to get out of your car, you're telling them that you can't access jobs and things. And so if you think about the history of economic mobility and who has benefited from the car-based culture, it hasn't been an equal benefit. And so often I think it's easiest to try to be sustainable in more urban communities due to the land use of those communities, but you're also asking technically those who have the more sustainable practices to bear the burden of climate change. And so I just like to think about how we frame sustainability when we're engaging in certain communities. Charles Brown, who does the Rest and Mobility podcast, recently had a podcast on the double-edged sword of green infrastructure that featured Alejandro Rigolon, who's from University of Utah. Great podcast, recommend listening to that. And despite all that, I would still work on this legislation because of this little one here, my 2-year-old who already loves to bike. So thanks for hearing me out, and there's my contact information.
Thank you, Dr. Chivers. Our third panelist in this session is Dr. Kate Lowe, an associate professor of urban planning and policy at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Dr. Lowe studies transportation at the intersection of policy, funding, and mobility justice. Her work examines how varied stakeholders and transportation policies interact across different levels of government and how this impacts transportation investments and racial inequities. Dr. Lowe?
Yeah, perfect.
I really enjoyed the last two presentations, and hopefully you'll see mine as complementing rather than duplicating some of those great ideas. But today, if we're talking about new solutions, I wanted to talk big picture, not incremental technical solutions. So I'm going to talk about spending space and new processes as the new solutions we need to seek. For my title slide, I was glad to hear some love for the bus, because here in Chicagoland, we see the L a lot. The L is iconic imagery for Chicago, but more rides happen every day on the bus than the L. So I wanted to celebrate the under-acknowledged role of the bus. And with that in mind, I also wanted to direct attention to mode shift over electrification in conversations about sustainable transportation. My argument is simply that our budgets and space allocation need to reflect that mode shift away from private vehicle use is more important for climate change than electrification of private car use. Our space and budgets don't reflect that. However, this is not to argue against electrification. We absolutely need electrification, but we need actions that level the playing field across modes. So in other words, I'm not coming for your car keys, but I am coming for highway dollars. I also want to acknowledge something that hopefully resonates with the presentation we just heard, is that mode shift is not equally viable for everyone. It's easy for me to shift modes from driving to walking or transit. I'm an affluent, overeducated, white, cisgender, dual income, no kids, resident of transit-rich Logan Square. This is really different than, I hear some locals. So this is really different than a black worker going to second shift in a transportation distribution and logistics neighborhood, or a caregiver trip chaining. So I want to acknowledge these solutions are not universal for people or places, but our budgets need to reflect what's most impactful for climate change. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time on my central argument of mode shift is more important than electrification, but I'm going to give you two data points. This is life cycle carbon dioxide emissions by mode. We see ride sourcing or ride hail. I won't call it ride share. That's another conversation. We see that has the biggest footprint in terms of carbon dioxide emissions. We see a couple bars down, private car, battery electric vehicle, substantially better. So electrification matters, but we also see bus, less impact, and rail and bike, much more impact in terms of carbon dioxide. And one thing, carbon dioxide is not the only emissions that we need to consider. Particulate matter. I know there was an earlier session on freight. Particulate matter is associated with freight. It is also associated with electric vehicles because of brake pads and tire wear and tear. So electrification matters, but mode shift is really important. Another reason mode shift is really important is life and death. These are vehicle deaths per 1 million residents in 20 rich countries. You can see the US is an outlier. And heavy electric vehicles are potentially deadly. Increasing shares of SUVs and large vehicles put the lives of rollers and pedestrians at risk. Again, we could talk more about why I'd argue mode shift is more important. Again, not a universal solution. Recognition, different people and places are positioned differently. But this is what our budget looks like. In the US, we spend so much more on roadways than transit, especially at the state and federal levels. Over recent decades, the approximation at the federal and state levels has been an 80-20 split, 80% tilted to highways. And that and other things, including land use, structural inequities, lots of factors, but within this transportation funding landscape, we have a disparity that looks like this. On average, not telling the whole story, but on average, 47 minutes to commute by bus, 26 minutes to commute by car. So who needs a quicker trip on average? It becomes a really logical choice to drive when that's the time gap. And not everyone experiences this equally, in part because of racist investment flows, land use, a whole host of factors. We see Black Chicagoland residents with the highest time burden, those earning the least with the highest time burden, even as they're consuming fewer miles. So I showed you historic funding splits. I showed you a couple data points on inequity. Again, transportation is not, of course, the only factor in equity, but there was a big infrastructure bill, right? Everything's changed. It's historic. So the infrastructure bill made historic investments in public transit, but also a lot of investment in highway. This graph from Transportation for America shows that highways received almost 4 times as much as public transit still. And the first presentation talked about the Reconnecting Communities program. The Reconnecting Community program is to acknowledge that highway building, as we saw in Baltimore, caused harm, especially in Black and brown communities. At the same time, we have this $3 billion pilot program to address harm. Federal dollars are enabling harm. Highway expansions are happening. Texas roadway proposals are destroying Black and brown communities. And the pilot program to repair harm is about 1/10 of what the highway budget is. So this is the landscape in which we're working. Federal is one level. States have some latitude, right? There's this amazing thing called flexing federal dollars. States can use federal dollars that are designated for highways and switch them to other modes. And active transportation, which I'm spending less, well, I'll get to that in a minute. But active transportation investments compared to the Jane Byrne interchange, a bargain. But what we see, Illinois is in red because here we are. But states aren't flexing their federal dollars. The top flexor, New York, is still flexing less than 16% of highway dollars. But switching by mode is not enough. This is a graph coming out of the San Francisco Bay Area. Just because we change budgets by mode doesn't guarantee equity. Here's a graph. We see AC Transit, which is only bus, is getting a public subsidy of less than $3 per trip. Caltrain, majority white, getting a subsidy over $13 per ride. So mode shift matters, but we have to pay attention even within modes. We heard this a little bit in the first presentation, but it takes resources to get resources. I did some research on the now defunct Tiger program, and we found more capacity was associated with more winning of federal dollars. Urban Institute just came out with research on the infrastructure bill. More resources meant likelihood of getting more resources. And another side note, how much money is flowing to consultants for all those applicants? So we have to think about how funds are distributed. And what if we start thinking about funding and budgets as moral documents, a connection that's often attributed to Martin Luther King Jr. We're not supporting sustainability and equity with our funding streams. I know you all are not controlling budgets individually and unilaterally, but we need to promote really frank conversation about what our budgets say. And we have to disseminate it and talk about the values that are embedded in our spending choices. I'm going to talk about another kind of budget, a space budget. This is a picture from Archer Avenue, which is on the southwest side of Chicago. We can see a lot of roadway capacity. And then I blew up some bike racks. Bike racks are not going to make it safe or appealing to bike on Archer Avenue. So I'm not saying shut down the road, but what if we yielded some space instead of giving so much space to the mode that is most dangerous and least sustainable? And what about our institutions? What about their space and financial budgets? Okay, let's come home to UIC. This is a picture from an anonymous bicyclist. Twitter is always a buzz around dorm move-in and move-out day. We see 2 empty lanes for cars, and we see cars blocking a bus stop and the bike lane on Halstead. I'm not saying we can't use cars to move in and out of dorms, but we have a lot of space that we could use differently and creatively. We could take one lane of traffic and have a temporary bike lane and space for dorm move in and out. Interestingly, Halstead, north of UIC and south of UIC, is only one lane. So what if we really radically rethought our space budget? In addition, thanks to a FOIA, I FOIA'd my own employer. Oh, the buffer tenure it gives you. So UIC's internal research shows we know there are numerous bike lane blockages. And we know 95% of those are pickup and drop-offs of UIC community members. Some people need pickups and drop-offs. People might have been priced out of Pilsen, an easy bike ride away with rents going through the sky. Maybe they have to trip chain. Maybe they have care responsibilities. We have to acknowledge people are positioned differently, but that we can level the playing field for modes. I don't think this would be very popular, but we have parking lots that could be repurposed. We could allocate our space budget differently and have an area for pickup and drop-offs that don't put bicyclists at danger or displace folks who rely on pickup and drop-off. Do you agree? Well, there's a QR code. Join our petition. And of course, this needs to be really done intentionally. We heard in the last presentation that there was a lot of pushback because engagement wasn't done the way folks wanted it to be. At UIC, we have to be mindful. We have a majority low-income undergraduate students. We're a Hispanic-serving institutions. So we have to think really carefully about how people are differently positioned. More broadly, how do we prioritize mode shift over electrification without excluding electrification or burdening either transition on those who are already the most disadvantaged? I've talked about changing budgets. Now I want to talk about processes, although I'm going to be briefer than the last presentation we just had on processes. So one way to approach this is valuing marginalized community voices as essential data, as this slide from the untokening asserts. It also challenges the reliance on quantitative data and the devaluing of community perspective. We have to budget time and money, and part of the budgeting time we heard is early, not after the parameters are already set and concessions are symbolic. And I get paid, so should people who are giving their time. And who wants to go to a meeting without impact? I certainly don't. We also have to create new spaces, and this should not be designed by me alone. These new spaces have to be co-designed. It's necessary but insufficient to invite marginalized voices to the existing table, because existing tables reflect existing structures of power. So we have to really think about new sites and processes. So to sum up, our budgets and space allocation need to reflect that mode shift away from private use is more important for climate change than electrification, but no solution is universal. Our space and financial budgets do not reflect our stated values. We don't hold the purse strings, but we can help challenge discourse to really grapple with space and financial budgets as moral documents. And there's my email, and then I'm on social media. I want to be really clear. I engage politically, so this is not a UIC Twitter account.
Thank you, Dr. Lowe. Okay. So our final panelist today is Reverend Courtney Carson, the Associate Vice President for External Affairs at Richland Community College. Reverend Carson also serves as an ordained minister at Love Fellowship Christian Church, state spokesperson for the Rainbow Push Coalition, president of the Southside Improvement Association, political strategist, and the creator of the award-winning trauma-sensitive workforce training program known as Enrich, which has helped more than 3,000 adults in the Decatur community earn wages at least 30% higher than the average living wage. Reverend?
In this space, we're all family, right? Can I call you all family? Family, what's going on? Listen up, we have a great problem, all right? We have a great problem. What's great is that the country is growing significantly, right? And we've seen this level of greatness and growth at least 4 times in our history. The first time with the combustion or the steam engine in the 19th century. Y'all remember that? Y'all act like y'all was born at that time. They like, yeah, right? The second time in the 20th century with mass production. Thank you, Henry Ford, right? And he just celebrated his 100th birthday this year, so we love Henry Ford. The third level of growth was the first wave of intimation in 1970, and we are currently living in our 4th level of growth right now due to EV and clean energy and AI. It is magnificent. I'm extremely excited about it, and you should too. Now, the problem is we have to train individuals for these particular jobs. There's 8 million vacant jobs right now. These individuals, we have to train them. By 2030, there'll be another, I think they said 8.5 million jobs around clean energy and EV and AI. So I'm excited because at the end of the day, growth always happens when there's a big manufacturing moment. Am I right about that? All right, I'm gonna ask y'all some questions like we in church. I promise I will not pass around a hat to take up an offering, but I am a Black Baptist preacher. You just never know, all right? So, what's magnificent about this significant level of growth and the wonderful problem that we do have? The issue is that the workforce is changing. We're living in it, literally by 50%, I was told. But what does that mean for Black and brown people? At least about 80%. I mean, I walked into the gas station just the other day. I grabbed some alkaline water and some potato chips. I don't know if that's really a good mix, but however, I went to pay for the alkaline water, the potato chips, and the brother that was behind the stand wasn't even looking at me. He was putting some cigarettes up. And I said, hey, my man, what's going on? And he pointed to this little contraption, this smart device, where I had to figure it out on I almost stole the stuff, all right? I'm trying to figure out how do I pay for this thing, but at the end of the day, workforce is looking different. So not only do we have to train those individuals who had lost their teller jobs, but we have to train this new wave, this new brain, and this new attitude as well, right? So thank God Richland Community College was able to produce this phenomenal, I'm gonna say it like this because I've created it, all right? This phenomenal workforce training called Enrich. What is Enrich? Enrich, I'm gonna say it slow for you. Enrich, what we believe that essential skills plus technical skills equals changed lives. We wholeheartedly believe that. What are essential skills? And I'm gonna get to my slides because I'm forgetting about it, okay? What are essential skills? Somebody, where's the clicker? Sorry, y'all. I'm hitting it. Cool beans, I'm gonna do it like this. Essential skills. Our essential skills at Richland Community College through Enrich, it's a little bit different. Everybody can learn life skills. Everybody can learn job skills, but we amalgamate the two with two trauma-sensitive practices termed motivational interviewing and the circle of courage that's utilized by indigenous people. They've been practicing the circle of courage for 17 generations. And I trust and believe me, it works. All right? So raise your hand if you ever heard the effervescent words given to Kevin Costner. If you build it, they will come. What movie was that? The Field of Dreams. At Richland Community College, we also believe if you build it, they will come. But however, we believe if you make it a safe place, they will stay. So within our program, we've been able to create a safe place of belonging, right? So that our students, our staff, and those who come through our program can master their gifts, their talents, and their skills, and independently utilize a level of generosity for to their counterparts. What does generosity mean? As simple as this: help somebody along the way. And we've been able to do that. So our essential skills, not only is mastery, belonging, independence the foundation of what we do inside a controlled classroom, we do it outside the classroom as well. And not only do we practice how to get a job, how to keep a job, how to grow in your job, shaking hands when you look at somebody, how to write a resume. Y'all know the stuff, the typical stuff that everybody utilizes. But what we do is activate your parasympathetic nervous system so that you can be triggered by a thing and then teach you how to balance it. Does that make sense to you? Right? Because what happens typically in the workplace, in a school, in Walmart, and even Kroger's, an individual will use a single word to trigger someone, and then there's a fight. And that's just bad for the company, right? Because we don't need people coming into our institutions and practicing a level of toxicity that will harm another individual in our company. Now, I got to say it like this because it's really, really special to me. This level of workforce training simply works. Somebody say, it works. Everybody say, it works. I'm happy you agree with me. So, what's magnificent about this situation? We've trained 3,246 people since 2016. That same year, 24/7 Wall Street wrote an article that reads, Decatur, Illinois is the third worst place for African Americans to live in 2016. That's when we began the Enrich program. 2023, the same 24/7 Wall Street Journal did the same case study, and they said, wow, Decatur, Illinois is now ranked number 24th. So there's growth in there. And I just believe we have something to do with that because 3,246 individuals, 81% of that 3,246 were African American. 92% of that number are at work today. Clap it up for that. That's huge. That's huge. 47% of that number are second chance citizens, directly impacted. Those individuals that we say got a felony on their record are coming out of the penal system. What's your secret sauce, Rev? Is that we put everybody in the same classroom, whether you're an ex-offender, a trust fund child, a college dropout, or a college graduate, and you're just looking for another skill to get you to the next level in your life. I stole that thing from Chick-fil-A. When you walk in Chick-fil-A, everybody get greeted the same way, right? And you never see a Chick-fil-A line empty, only on Sundays because they're going to church, all right? So listen, it's magnificent. These individuals come through our training, 12-week program, 67 hours of essential skills. And then we send, before they leave, before they're able to touch a CDL truck, a welding, going to a welding torch, or touch machinery that costs $200,000, they have to take the essential skills so that we can deal with who they are. So quite naturally, 12-week course, we pay individuals a stipend, $13 an hour, 40 hours a week, because we feel like if you're going to spend that much time with us, we don't want to create another barrier in your life, right? So that you're able to pay your rent, pay the power bill if that's an issue. And also, we have full wraparound services where we quite naturally pay for your transportation, pay for your child care if need be, take you to the clothing store so that you can look just as fly as me. Yeah? Okay. All right. But it's such a life-changing program. I'm extremely excited when I see individuals graduate, and it's a sea of beautiful people, black, white, brown, yellow, Barney purple. But it's magnificent when I see the smiles on individuals' faces when they graduate and then they come into the program. 12-week program, you get paid $13 an hour, 40 hours a week. You receive 6 nationally recognized certifications after you receive your focal certification. So if it's welding, we're going to give you the other stuff. If it's CDL, quite naturally, you'll receive all 4 endorsements in our CDL program, right? Hazmat, passenger, triples and doubles, and also forklift certifications, flagger certifications, and our CDL, because we want you to be we want you to be extremely employable when you leave our program. And that's one of the reasons why folks come to us. I have a hard time keeping my industry partners away from my darn training before these folks graduate, because they know they're coming in. When they come into an institution, they know they'll be great for the environment, great for the culture, and just because they practice belonging, mastery, generosity, and independence. I got 5 more minutes. Raise your hand if I can have 5 more minutes. 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. Sorry, baby, they done gave me 25 more minutes. I'm gonna use that 5 minutes and just allow a video to tell the story for us really, really quick. And I'll say this too. President Valdez was asked by President Colleton, President of the Senate, to write legislation around this. Our enriched workforce training, that curriculum is at 23 other community colleges in the state. Colleton said if a community college would like to have this particular training, then they should utilize or do it the Richland way. And so we were gracious enough to share that information with everybody else, and they've been doing it magnificently. We started in construction, now in manufacturing and healthcare. Memorial Health System gave us $3.2 million to produce a training for them. We've been able to, we got 400 folk in the healthcare system right now. I'm going to EV right now. And then quite naturally partnered with TCCI, the only American-made compressor, and we are the only community college that's within the manufacturing company. So we'll train individuals and then put them on the floor, and we created this Illinois EV Innovation Hub. Quite naturally, we're tackling high school students, getting them early in the 8th grade. By the time they go into high school, they can go through our STEM Academy and our Prep Academy. And by the time they graduate high school, they'll have a diploma, high school diploma in one hand and an ASS in engineering in the other. And then they can matriculate into some of the most attractive four-year universities in the state of Illinois. It's magnificent because at the end of the day, we have to train individuals for this new wave of workforce. And I just really believe that this is the way. So if any of you, and I know U of I, y'all some bad folks. Y'all good. Got the most attractive engineering school. So if anyone else needs some help in the state of Illinois, please come visit us at Richland Community College and TCCI so that we can put these folks to work. Amen? Amen. Thank you so much.